It all started on a quiet Sunday morning. My wife was making breakfast, humming softly while rubbing her belly. She was 8 months pregnant, glowing, and full of life. The sun was just rising through the blinds, and I remember thinking how peaceful everything felt. I had no idea that within the next few hours, everything would explode, and the people who were supposed to protect the peace of our neighborhood would try to destroy ours. I'm not exaggerating when I say that day changed everything. It exposed the dark, hidden power of the HOA, the so-called Homeowners Association, that acted like they ruled over everyone's lives. If you've ever lived in an HOA neighborhood, you already know how crazy they can get. But what happened to my wife and me? That went beyond crazy. It turned into something dangerous, something that crossed every line of decency. At first, it was just small things. Notes on our door. Emails about violations. You'd think we were criminals for leaving our trash cans out too long or not mowing the grass the exact way they wanted. I laughed it off, I thought. It's just rules, whatever. But my wife hated it. She said the way they looked at us made her uncomfortable, like we didn't belong. Then came the warnings. You're not in compliance. You're violating community standards. Every letter sounded colder, more official. They started taking pictures of our house, our windows, our yard, even our front porch. And I'll never forget the day my wife came to me crying, holding one of those letters, her hands shaking. She said, "Why are they doing this to us?" That was the moment I knew something was wrong. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, they were targeting us. One of the board members, a guy named Carl, seemed to take it personally. He'd drive by slowly, staring at our house. He'd make little comments about keeping up appearances and being good residents. I didn't say anything at first, because my wife was pregnant, and I didn't want stress around her. But deep down, something in my gut told me this wasn't normal. Then one morning, everything snapped. I was at work when my wife called me. Her voice was trembling. She said, "They're here. They're trying to come inside." I froze. "Who's there?" I asked. And she said words I'll never forget, "The HOA." I thought she was joking. I said, "What do you mean, the HOA?" She whispered, "They're banging on the door. They said they're coming in to inspect. They said I have to open up or they'll call the police." My blood went cold. My pregnant wife, alone in the house, while a group of HOA members were trying to force their way in. I dropped everything and raced home. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the steering wheel. Every red light felt like an eternity. When I pulled into the driveway, there they were, 3 men from the HOA board standing on my porch, yelling through the door. My wife was inside crying. I jumped out of the car and shouted, "What the hell are you doing?" One of them turned to me, calm as ever, and said, "We have the right to enter. You're in violation of multiple codes." Violation of what? I snapped. My wife is 8 months pregnant, and you're pounding on the door like a SWAT team. He smirked. "Sir, step aside. We're allowed to inspect." And that's when I lost it. I told them to get off my property. They refused. They said I'd signed the agreement when we moved in, that I had no choice. No choice. To let strangers walk into my home while my wife was terrified? My wife came to the window, crying. "Please stop," she begged. But they wouldn't. They actually called the police, telling them I was being uncooperative. Can you imagine? The HOA calling the cops on me, because I was protecting my pregnant wife. But fate had its own way of serving justice that day. When the sheriff arrived, I expected more trouble. I thought they'd take the HOA's side. But what happened next? I'll never forget it. The sheriff stepped out of his car, looked at the 3 HOA members, and said, "Who called this in?" Carl, that smug HOA guy, raised his hand. "I did, officer. This man is refusing lawful inspection of his property." The sheriff narrowed his eyes. "Lawful inspection?" He turned to me and asked, "Sir, did you invite them here?" I said, "No, sir. My wife is 8 months pregnant, and they're trying to break in." The sheriff's face changed immediately. He turned back to the HOA guys and said, "You 3, off his porch." "No." Carl looked shocked. "Officer, you don't understand. "No, you don't understand," the sheriff interrupted. "This is private property. You don't set foot here without permission. Do it again, and I'll have you arrested." For the first time that day, I saw fear in Carl's eyes. He stammered something about community rules and bylaws, but the sheriff wasn't having it. He pointed toward the street. "Out. All of you." They hesitated, until the sheriff took a step forward, hand resting on his belt. Then they moved. My wife opened the door, tears streaming down her face. The sheriff softened his tone instantly. "Ma'am, you okay?" She nodded, trying to speak but too shaken to get the words out. The sheriff looked at me and said quietly, "If they bother you again, call me directly. I've dealt with these HOA types before. They think they're the law. They're not." That moment, that calm authority in his voice, it was like a wave of relief washing over us. For weeks, we'd felt powerless. But right then, for the first time, someone stood up for us. That night, my wife couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the pounding on the door, the shouting. She'd put her hands on her stomach and whisper, "You're safe, baby. You're safe." And I'd just sit there, feeling both angry and grateful. Angry that people could be so heartless, and grateful that someone stepped in before things went too far. The next morning, I saw something that made my blood boil all over again. A fresh letter taped to our door. From the HOA. It said, "Due to your aggressive behavior and refusal to comply, further action will be taken." I crumpled it in my hand. They weren't done. Not even after being pulled off by the sheriff. But this time, I wasn't scared. I was ready. Because here's the truth. When you push good people too far, they stop being silent. And I was done being silent. I started documenting everything. Every letter, every email, every threat. I reached out to other neighbors, and what I learned shocked me. We weren't the only ones. The HOA had been bullying people for years. Fining them for decorations, for garden plants, even for kids playing too loudly outside. People were scared to speak up. But when they heard what happened to my wife, something changed. They started talking. One by one, they shared their stories. And soon, we realized, we had power too. So I started planning. I wasn't just going to fight back for myself. I was going to fight for everyone they'd ever intimidated. And when I tell you what happened next, you won't believe how far this went. They thought they could silence us. They thought they could control everything. But they were wrong. Because the same sheriff who pulled them off my porch was about to uncover something that would shake the entire HOA to its core. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. The air outside felt heavy, almost like the calm before a storm. My wife was still asleep, curled up peacefully for the first time in days. I stood by the window, staring at the letter from the HOA crumpled on the counter. It wasn't just paper anymore. It was a symbol of everything they'd tried to take from us. Our peace, our safety, our dignity. And I knew, deep down, that I couldn't let them do it to anyone else. I drove to the sheriff's office that morning. The same officer who helped us, Sheriff Daniels, was sitting behind his desk when I walked in. He looked up, recognized me instantly, and said, "I was hoping you'd come." He leaned back, folded his arms, and said, "You're not the first person to have trouble with that HOA. But you might be the first to stand up to them." That caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" I asked. He opened a drawer and pulled out a folder, thick, worn, full of papers. "Complaints," he said. "Years' worth. People fined for nonsense, harassed, even threatened. But no one ever pushed back hard enough for it to go anywhere." I stared at the folder, my stomach tightening. "So they've been doing this for years." He nodded slowly. "And they've been getting away with it. Until now." That's when he asked if I'd be willing to give a statement, to make it official. My heart was pounding, but I said yes. Not for me, but for my wife, for our baby, and for every neighbor who'd been too afraid to speak. When I got home, my wife was sitting at the table with her laptop open. She looked up and said, "I've been reading. Do you know how much power an HOA really has?" She showed me articles, laws, horror stories from people all over the country. Stories just like ours. People losing homes, being fined into bankruptcy, all because of petty, corrupt boards. It was sickening. And suddenly, Our little story didn't feel small anymore. It felt big. That night, I sent out a message to our neighborhood group chat, something simple but powerful. If the HOA has ever threatened you, fined you unfairly, or made you feel unsafe, message me. It's time we stop being quiet. At first, silence. I thought maybe nobody would respond. Then, one by one, the messages started coming in. They fined us for painting our mailbox. They yelled at my son for parking too close to the curb. They told me I couldn't put up a Christmas wreath. By the end of the night, I had over 30 messages. 30 families who had been living under fear. The next day, Sheriff Daniels came by to check on my wife. He brought 2 deputies with him, not for drama, but for protection. He told me something that made my blood run cold. He said, "We've been looking into your HOA's finances, and things don't add up." Apparently, large amounts of money had been withdrawn from the HOA's maintenance fund, cash that was supposed to go to repairs, landscaping, community upgrades. But instead, it was disappearing into miscellaneous expenses. Carl, the same guy who tried to force his way into my house, was listed as the treasurer. I felt my fists clench. "You mean he's been stealing?" The sheriff didn't answer directly. He just said, "We're investigating. But I need you to be careful. When people like that start getting desperate, they do stupid things." And he was right. That evening, just as the sun went down, I saw Carl's truck creeping past my house. He stopped, stared at our window, and then drove off slowly. My wife saw him too, and I could see the fear return in her eyes. I called the sheriff immediately. Within minutes, a patrol car was parked near our house. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying everything in my mind, how something so small, like a neighborhood association, had turned into a nightmare, and how one man's greed had nearly endangered my pregnant wife. But the next morning brought the twist I never saw coming. I was making coffee when I heard tires screech outside. I looked out the window and saw 3 police SUVs pulling up in front of Carl's house. Officers jumped out, shouting commands. My wife came running. "What's happening?" I stepped onto the porch just as they escorted Carl out in handcuffs. The sheriff was there, talking to him calmly but firmly. Turns out, the investigation moved fast. They found forged invoices, fake contractors, and thousands of dollars funneled into Carl's personal account. He'd been stealing from the HOA for years, covering it up by blaming resident violations. Every fine, every threat, it was all part of the cover-up. The entire neighborhood came out to watch. Some people gasped. Some clapped. A few even cried. I just stood there, holding my wife's hand, feeling the weight lift off my chest. Later that week, the HOA board was dissolved completely. Every member resigned. The sheriff helped the county appoint a temporary administrator to handle community affairs until new elections could be held. And the best part? The people who had been too afraid to speak, they started smiling again. Neighbors waved. Kids played outside. For the first time in years, our neighborhood felt alive. But it wasn't just about winning. It was about learning. Because the truth is, when you let fear control you, corruption thrives. But when you speak up, even if your voice shakes, everything can change. One evening, about a month later, I was sitting on the porch with my wife. The air was cool, the sun was dipping below the rooftops, and she was rocking gently in her chair, holding her belly. She said, "Do you ever think about how different it could have been? What if the sheriff hadn't shown up?" I swallowed hard. "I try not to." She looked at me and smiled softly. "You know what's crazy? Maybe this all happened for a reason. Maybe our baby's meant to grow up in a place where people finally stand up for each other." I didn't know what to say. I just reached for her hand and said, "Then let's make sure it stays that way." A few weeks later, Sheriff Daniels stopped by again, off duty this time. He handed us a small blue blanket as a baby gift and said, "You two did good. You didn't just protect your home, you protected your whole community." My wife teared up. She hugged him, and for a moment, everything came full circle. What started as fear ended in unity. Months later, when our daughter was born, I remember holding her and whispering, "You're safe. Nobody's ever going to scare us like that again." Because now, We weren't just homeowners. We were protectors. And that little girl, she became the reminder that sometimes the smallest voices are the ones worth fighting for. To this day, when people ask me about the HOA story, I tell them one thing. Evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it hides behind paperwork and rules. But the moment you stop being afraid, it loses its power.